There is a single line buried inside the Ethiopian Bible that, once you read it, you will never be able to unread. It is a passage that most Christians on earth have never seen, never heard quoted in a sermon, and never even knew existed. And it describes what happened to Jesus in the 3 days between the cross and the empty tomb. Not the part you were told in church, the part that was left out. And when you actually sit with what it says, the resurrection stops being the gentle sunrise on Sunday story you grew up with and becomes something far stranger, far older, and frankly, far more disturbing. I want to be clear right away, because I hate channels that bait you with a title and then waste 20 minutes circling the point. So here is the promise of this video, stated plainly. There is a body of scripture preserved only in the Ethiopian tradition that fills in the missing 72 hours of the resurrection, what Jesus was actually doing while his body lay in the grave, and the answer it gives is not resting. The answer it gives is that he went somewhere. He did something down there. And the reason that account never made it into the Bible sitting on your shelf is not because it's fake. It's the opposite problem. It's because of what it implies about who, exactly, walked back out of the realm of the dead with him. We are going to get to that passage. I'm going to read it to you. But to understand why it lands like a punch to the chest, you first have to understand the book it comes from, because this is not some scribbled note found in a drawer. This is one of the oldest, most complete, and most deliberately ignored Bibles that has ever existed on this planet. So stay with me, because by the end of this, the word resurrection is going to mean something different to you than it did 60 seconds ago. Let's start with the book itself, because the credibility of the passage rests entirely on the credibility of where it comes from. And the Ethiopian Bible is not a minor side document. It is, by several measures, the heavyweight in the room that nobody invited to the conversation. Most people, when they say the Bible, are picturing 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. That's the King James shape, the one that became the global default. The Ethiopian Bible has 88. It contains the books, you know, and then it keeps going. It holds scrolls from the Old Testament, scrolls from the New Testament, and texts that most of the Christian world has quite literally never laid eyes on. Books like Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the works that were quietly filed away as too much by everyone else. And here is the detail that should make you sit up. Ethiopia did not receive these texts late, as some afterthought of a fully formed religion handed down from Europe. It's the reverse. Christianity wasn't given to Ethiopia, Christianity was already there. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is, by a strong argument, the oldest organized Christian body on the face of the earth, older than the institution most people assume holds that title. When a 6th century Egyptian monk and traveler named Cosmas visited, he recorded that Ethiopia was already, unmistakably, a Christian country, its rulers throwing open their borders to refugees, fleeing persecution everywhere else. Certain Ethiopian communities trace a worship tradition that reaches back over 3,000 years. This is a nation that was never colonized, that kept its own language, its own liturgy, and its own scripture intact, while empires rose and fell around it. So, when a country like that, a country with that depth of continuity, that lineage, that refusal to be overwritten, preserves a version of the resurrection that the rest of the world dropped, you do not get to wave it away as a curiosity. You have to ask the harder question. Not, why does Ethiopia have this strange extra text? The honest question is, why is it the only one that still does? Hold on to that question, because the moment you start pulling on it, things start to unravel in a way the institutions of the West would really prefer you didn't notice. Before we touch the resurrection passage itself, I have to show you something else the Ethiopian tradition preserves, because it's the thread that leads straight to it, and it is genuinely one of the strangest things in any Christian scripture anywhere. In the Ethiopian Holy Week readings, there is a text the tradition keeps that tells a story from the night of the Last Supper. According to it, the meal was prepared in a particular house, and a roasted bird, a rooster, had been cooked and set on the table. And in this account, Jesus does something that appears nowhere in the 4 Gospels most of the world reads. He takes that cooked, dead bird, and he brings it back to life. The rooster stands up off the plate. And then Jesus gives it an order. Follow Judas. Watch what he does. Come back and report the betrayal. Now sit with how bizarre that is for a second. Before he is betrayed, before the cross, before any of it, the Ethiopian tradition records Jesus performing a small, almost private resurrection on a bird at dinner as a kind of witness and a warning. A dead thing made to live again, and immediately sent out as a messenger of what's coming. People hear that and laugh it off as folklore. But I'd ask you to notice the shape of it instead, because this tradition is telling you, days before the crucifixion, that the central theme of what's about to happen is not death. It's the reversal of death. It's planting the idea, on purpose, that the man at the head of that table has authority over the line between living and dead, and that he is willing to cross it. That's the foreshadow. That's the tradition warming you up, and it raises the obvious question that the rest of this video exists to answer. If he could do that to a roasted bird at a dinner table casually, almost as a footnote, then what exactly happened when he died? What does a man with that kind of authority do when it's his own body in the tomb and 3 full days to fill? The standard Bible you know goes quiet here. It draws a curtain. Friday evening, the body is sealed in the tomb. Sunday morning, the stone is rolled away and he's gone. In between nothing. Silence, a gap. The most important 72 hours in the entire religion, and the canonical text essentially skips them. The Ethiopian Bible does not skip them. And that is the whole problem. So here's where I have to be careful, because what I'm about to walk you toward is the thing the title promised, and I don't want to spoil the weight of it by blurting it out before you understand what you're looking at. Let me frame the question precisely. Every Easter, billions of people celebrate a story with a very specific emotional tone. It's peaceful, it's triumphant in a quiet way. Mary comes to the tomb in the cool of the morning. The stone is already moved, an angel says, "He is not here, he is risen." And there's a sense of a gentle, miraculous sunrise. Death undone softly. That's the picture in your head, and it's the picture by design. The Ethiopian material describes those same 3 days completely differently. In that tradition, the resurrection is not a sunrise. It is the aftermath of a raid. Something violent happened underground while the surface world slept. Something with a body count, except the bodies were going the wrong direction. And the disturbing part, the part that genuinely changes the meaning of the holiday, is not just that he descended somewhere, it's what he came back with. It's who and how many, and what that says about the entire shape of the story you were handed. I'm going to tell you exactly what that passage says. I'm going to read the heart of it, but if I just drop it on you cold, you'll do what everyone does with information out of context. You'll file it as a weird fact and move on. So, before we open that door, you need the history. You need to understand how the Bible you own got the shape it has, what was cut out of it, and who did the cutting. Because once you see how the sausage was actually made, once you see how close we came to this passage being standard scripture for everyone, the disturbing part stops being the passage. The disturbing part becomes the fact that it was taken away from you on purpose. So, let's take a short history lesson. I promise it's the fastest path to the payoff, and I promise the payoff is worth it. Here is the thing almost nobody is taught. The Bible, as a single fixed object, did not fall out of the sky bound in leather. For the first few centuries of Christianity, the Bible was not one book. It was a swirling library of competing scrolls, rival gospels, and wildly different accounts of who Jesus was and what he did. There were dozens of gospels. Gospels attributed to Peter, to Thomas, to Mary, to Nicodemus, to Philip. Some agreed with each other, many flatly contradicted each other. And the public, with no way to fact-check anything in a world without printing, believed whatever circulated. Think of it like this. In the first century, books were written about the life of Jesus the way fan fiction gets written about a popular character today. Some careful and sincere, some inventive, some outright agenda-driven. The difference is that there was no internet, no library of record, no way to quickly check a claim. And as we all know, a sensational story travels faster and further than a careful one. So, you ended up with a society marinating in dozens of versions of the same events, with no agreed way to sort them. This terrified the early church leadership, and you can understand why. If everyone believes a different Jesus, you don't have a religion, you have chaos. So they started holding councils to settle it. The Council of Nicaea in the year 325, the First Council of Constantinople in 381. At these gatherings, church authorities began the brutal work of deciding which books were in and which were out. Their rough rules: a text should trace back to one of Jesus' actual followers or an eyewitness, it should date to the 1st century, and it should harmonize with the rest of the accepted material. Anything that failed those tests got the label non-canonical, which is the polite, scholarly way of saying removed. Now layer on the translations. The original texts were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. In around the year 400, a scholar named Jerome produced the great Latin translation known as the Vulgate, which became the backbone of Western Christianity for the next 1,000 years. But even the Vulgate didn't end the chaos. By the 1500s and 1600s, there were still competing versions, competing translations, competing readings floating around enough that it actively bothered the people in power. Which brings us to the single most influential edit in the history of the English Bible, King James. The reigning monarch wanted one authoritative version partly to settle the endless religious squabbling, and let's be honest, partly because a single unified Bible under his name reinforced his own authority. He assembled 47 scholars, split them into 6 teams, and set them to work for 7 years, cross-checking the existing translations under strict rules meant to limit bias. When their independent results came back remarkably consistent, the church approved it, and in 1611 the King James Bible was published. And because printing technology had advanced, it spread further and faster than any version before it. It became the default Bible for the entire English-speaking world. Here's why all of that matters for our story. Every one of those steps, Jerome's translation, the councils, the King James standardization, was also a filtering step. Each one trimmed the library down, each one decided what billions of people would and would not get to read. And every book that didn't make the cut quietly slid out of collective memory until most people forgot it had ever been on the table at all. Now, while the West was busy trimming, filtering, translating, and standardizing its way down to 66 books, Ethiopia trimmed nothing. It kept the whole library, all 88, including the texts that describe those missing 3 days. So the question that should be burning a hole in you right now is simple. Of everything that got cut, why was the descent, the part about what Jesus did in death, one of the things the West was happiest to lose? That's the question we're finally ready to answer. Here is the first piece of the passage, and the first reason it was buried. In the Ethiopian tradition, the 3 days are not empty. When Jesus dies on the cross, his body lies in the tomb, but he does not. He goes down. The tradition describes a descent into the realm of the dead, into Sheol, the grave, the underworld, the holding place where, according to ancient Hebrew belief, every soul went after death. Not a place of fire and punishment originally, just the great silent prison where the dead waited. Every human being who had ever died, the righteous and the wicked, the patriarchs and the murderers, Adam himself, all of them, were understood to be down there, in the dark, with no way out. Because that was the iron rule of the universe. The dead do not return. The gate only opens one way. And the Ethiopian account says Jesus walked through that gate alive. This is the doctrine that survives in fuller form in Ethiopian scripture, and the related texts, what some traditions call the descent, and what the medieval church would later soften into a phrase you might have heard recited and never thought about. He descended into hell. It's right there in the old creed. Most people who say it out loud have no idea what they're saying. They think it's a metaphor for suffering. It isn't. The Ethiopian material treats it as a literal event, with a literal location, and it describes the scene. And the scene is not gentle. Picture it the way the tradition frames it. The gates of the underworld, ancient, sealed, never once breached in the entire history of the human race, and a figure walking toward them from the inside of death itself. The text describes the powers of that place recognizing what was coming and trying to hold the doors. They could not hold the doors. He broke them. The barrier that had contained every human soul since the first death shattered, from the inside, by a dead man who refused to stay dead. Sit with the imagery for a second, because this is the first disturbing turn. The empty tomb on Sunday morning, the part everyone celebrates, is, in this telling, not the main event. It's the exit wound. It's where he came back out. The real event happened somewhere you were never shown, in the dark, 3 days deep, where he kicked down the gates of the grave. The peaceful sunrise story is the surface of a much more violent thing, and we'll get to why that matters, because he did not break those gates to walk out alone. Now, I have to pause and tell you something about the Ethiopian Bible itself, because even within Ethiopia, there's a layer to this that tells you you're standing near something sensitive. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't have one canon, it has two. There's the broader canon, the famous, expansive version, with around 81 books, the one that contains Enoch, Jubilees, the additional epistles, the whole sprawling library. And there's the narrow canon, a tighter version with fewer books, around 72, that was promoted under the modern Ethiopian state as the official completed version. And here's the detail that should raise the hair on your neck. The broader canon, the bigger, older, more complete one, the one that holds the more expansive and more unsettling material, has not been reprinted in its full form since the early 20th century. Read that again. The richest version of the oldest Bible on earth quietly stopped rolling off the presses about 100 years ago. Not banned with a public decree, not burned in a square. Just not reprinted. Allowed to thin out. Allowed to fade from circulation until the copies that exist are rare, fragile, and mostly locked away in monasteries. I'm not going to stand here and hand you a tidy conspiracy with a villain's name attached, because the honest answer is that the reasons are tangled up in politics and theology I can't fully verify on camera. What I'll tell you is this: when the most complete version of a sacred text becomes the version that's hardest to actually obtain, that pattern is worth noticing on its own. A book doesn't have to be forbidden to be buried. It just has to become inconvenient to print. And the material we're building toward the full account of what came back out of the grave lives in exactly that harder-to-find layer. So, the suppression we talked about earlier, the trimming the West did over centuries, it has a quieter cousin happening inside the tradition that preserved the most. Keep that in your back pocket, because it's about to matter. Before the payoff, 2 more reasons this passage stayed hidden, and they're the practical machinery behind everything we've said. The first wall is language. The Ethiopian Bible is written in Ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language that, today, even most Ethiopians don't speak in daily life. Ge'ez is to Ethiopia roughly what Latin is to Europe: sacred, beautiful, and locked. For centuries, the descent material, the full resurrection account, all of it sat encoded in a language that virtually no outsider could read. You can't be scandalized by a passage you can't translate. The text wasn't hidden in a vault, it was hidden in plain sight, behind a wall of grammar. The lack of translations, the lack of scholars working across that barrier, kept the most provocative parts of this Bible effectively invisible to the wider Christian world for over 1,000 years. Obscurity did the work that censorship would have. The second wall is the one I find harder to forgive, and its power. Go back to the early centuries of the Church, the period when all those competing gospels were being sorted into in and out. The people running that process were not neutral spiritual seekers in a quiet room. They were operating inside the machinery of the Roman Empire, and Rome cared about one thing above all others: control, authority. A unified story that produced unified, governable subjects. A scripture that emphasized order, hierarchy, and the institution as the gatekeeper between you and God was useful. A scripture that emphasized a Christ who personally tore down the gates of death and walked straight into the prison of the dead to drag people out himself, with no priest, no ritual, no institution in the middle, was a great deal less useful if you happen to be the institution. There's a tradition that, in the early consolidation of the canon, church authority in Rome ordered the destruction of scrolls that didn't fit the approved narrative, and that some scribes, unwilling to obey, hid copies away instead. We know for a fact that exactly this kind of preservation by hiding happened, because in the 1940s, ancient hidden scrolls were discovered in jars in caves near the Dead Sea, having survived precisely because someone stashed them out of reach of the people who wanted them gone. That single archaeological fact tells you the whole game. There were texts worth hiding, and there were powers worth hiding them from. The Bible most people hold today is, in part, the version that the powerful found acceptable. The Ethiopian Bible is closer to the version nobody got to edit. Language hid the passage from outsiders. Power decided outsiders shouldn't have it anyway. And underneath both walls, the passage just waited for someone to translate it, for someone to ask what it actually said. So let's finally ask. Let's open it. Here is the disturbing thing. Here is what the new translation work and the surviving Ethiopian material actually describe happening in those 3 days. I'm going to give it to you in full now, because you've earned the context to feel its weight. When Jesus broke the gates of the underworld, he was not there for himself. The Ethiopian descent tradition is emphatic about his purpose. He went down to empty the place. The text describes him moving through the realm of the dead and reaching out first to Adam, the first man, the origin of the whole human catastrophe, the one whose death started the chain that put everyone else in that pit. And the tradition describes Jesus taking Adam by the hand and pulling him up out of the dark, and then Eve. And then the line of the dead behind them, the patriarchs, the prophets, the righteous of every generation who had died across thousands of years with no way out, all of them waiting in that prison. He didn't preach to them through the bars. He opened the bars. The passage describes a great procession of the dead walking up and out of the grave behind him. That is the resurrection the Ethiopian tradition preserves, not one man rising. A jailbreak of the entire human dead, led by a figure who got himself executed specifically so he'd be on the inside when the doors came down. And now here is the line that should genuinely unsettle you, the part the surface story sands away. Your own standard gospel, the canonical one, actually contains a fossil of this. It's in Matthew. At the moment Jesus dies, the text says the earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open, and that the bodies of dead holy people were raised, came out of their graves, and walked into the city, and were seen by many. It's 2 verses. Most pastors skip them entirely, because they are deeply strange and nobody knows what to do with them. But they're right there in the Bible. You already own a brief, almost panicked admission that when this man died, the dead came back with him. The canonical text mentions it and immediately moves on, like someone admitting something out loud and then changing the subject. The Ethiopian tradition is the one that actually tells you what those 2 verses are the tip of. So here is the disturbing revelation, stated as plainly as I can state it. The resurrection you celebrate is not the story of a man who came back to life. It's the surviving, sanitized fragment of a story about a man who walked into death's prison and let everyone out, and the version that told that fuller story was filtered, untranslated, and quietly left to go out of print, until the only place on earth that still held it intact was a handful of monasteries on Ethiopian mountaintops. And ask yourself why that fuller version was the inconvenient one. Because a Christ who privately rises and ascends keeps the institution in the middle. You still need the church, the priest, the ritual, the gatekeeper, but a Christ who personally kicked down the gates of the grave and dragged the entire human dead out by the hand. Adam, Eve, the murderers, and the saints alike. With no ceremony and no permission, that is a Christ who already finished the job directly, for everyone. No middleman required. That is a far more radical, far more universal, and far more uncontrollable story than the quiet sunrise at the tomb. And you can see, can't you, why some people across 2,000 years might have preferred the quiet version, why the louder one stayed locked in gaze, why the broader canon stopped getting printed. The disturbing thing about the resurrection isn't ghoulish. It's that it was bigger than you were allowed to know, and the size of it is exactly what made it dangerous to the people standing between you and it. In recent years, that has started to crack. Scholars are finally translating the Ge'ez. Academics are taking the Ethiopian canon seriously as one of the most important surviving witnesses to what early Christianity actually looked like before the filtering began. The Ethiopian Church itself has worked to make this material accessible in more languages so that for the first time in centuries, ordinary people outside those mountain monasteries can read what was kept. The wall of language is coming down, slowly. But it's coming down. And personally, I find it almost unbelievable that any of this survived to be read at all. Think about what this book lived through. Invasion, war, foreign armies, a fire in the 1930s that burned the monastery church where some of these texts were kept, and the scripture survived even that. Empires that wanted it gone, languages that locked it away, 100 years of going quietly out of print, and it is still here, still legible, still telling the part of the story that everyone else dropped. Which takes me right back to where we started. That single line you'd never be able to unread. The one that turns the tomb from a peaceful sunrise into the exit from a raid on death itself. You came into this video knowing the resurrection as the day one man came back. I hope you're leaving it understanding what the oldest surviving Bible on earth has been quietly insisting for over 1,000 years, that he didn't come back alone, that he never intended to, and that the truly disturbing thing about Easter is not what happened to Jesus in that grave, it's who he refused to leave behind in it. That's the passage. That's what it reveals. And now that you've seen it, you'll notice its shadow every single time someone tells you the small, safe version of the story. Look it up for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Read the Descent. Read the 2 verses in Matthew nobody preaches. And then decide which version of the resurrection you were actually handed and which one was kept from you, on a mountain, in a language they hoped you'd never learn to read.